Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Bold and beautiful today. The hallway outside the superintendent's suite felt like a battleground in the fate of Ridge's sonorous command. The words "get back to your mama's company" still echoing through glass walls and pulsing hearts as Will stood frozen, jaw tight, eyes glassy. Every ounce of confidence he'd walked in with now stripped down. And yet he didn't run, he didn't bow, he simply gobbled and lifted his chin, gaping back at Ridge with an admixture of hurt and defiance that made Brooke's casket pang. Because in that instant Will didn't look like a reckless intern or an entitled heritage sprat. He looked like a son being rejected, and Ridge, pacing like a boxed captain, couldn't see it, too dazed by pride, by old injuries with Katie, by the troubling fear that every Logan child carried chaos in their DNA, snapping that Forrester Creations was a playground for Brooke's family trials, that he'd erected this house with blood and vision, that no bone booged in just because of a last name. And Will eventually spoke, his voice shaking but strong, saying he no way asked for special treatment, that he stayed late, studied every design, learned every pattern, and believed in this company because it was his family too. And Ridge barked that family didn't betray trust, didn't leak sketches, didn't stir drama between departments, and the blameworthiness hit like a poke, because Will hadn't done it, and everyone knew it, especially Hope, who stood behind Brooke with gashes streaming, wanting to scream that Thomas had manipulated the entire situation, that Will had been set up. But the moment swallowed her courage, and Brooke stepped forward, contending with Ridge to decelerate down, to flash back what it was like when people misdoubted him, when Eric gave him a chance despite the odds. But Ridge whirled on her, eyes blazing, criminating her of always choosing her kiddies over the company, over him, and Brooke. Rumored that she had chosen him for decades, had fought for him, lost him, set up him again, and now she was watching him destroy a boy who only wanted to belong. And Will eventually cracked, saying perhaps that was the real crime, that he wanted to belong to a family that no way completely wanted him, that he grew up watching Forrester glamour from the outside, seeing Ridge as an idol, featuring of earning that respect, and now realizing it was no way his to earn, that some doors were sealed before he ever touched them. And Ridge's expression flitted, commodity-like guilt slicing through the wrathfulness. But Steffi's sharp voice cut in, reminding everyone that business was remedy, that trust was everything, and if Will's presence compromised it, also Ridge was right, and those words sealed Will's fate, because Ridge uncurled, cold resoluteness returning, telling Will security would companion him out, effective incontinently, and the sound of steps approaching felt like a verdict, and Brooke cried out, gripping Ridge's arm, soliciting him not to do this, advising that he'd lament it, that he was creating an adversary out of a boy who should have been a supporter, and Ridge muttered that adversaries were easier to manage than arrears, and Will, eyes burning, looked at each of them, at Hope, at Brooke, at Ridge, and said still that he'd leave, not because he was shamefaced, but because he refused to supplicate for quality. And as he walked past Ridge, he broke just long enough to say that one day Ridge would realize he hadn't fired a problem. He'd fired the future, and the doors closed behind him with a futurity that gurgled through the structure, news spreading like campfire through cells and workrooms, contrivers bruiting, interns gaping, the myth of Forrester mercy shattered in seconds, and outdoors, Will stepped into the sun feeling like he'd been pushed off a precipice, his phone buzzing with textbooks from Katie, from musketeers, from people who had believed in him, and he compartmented a single communication to his mama: "He fired me." Ahead sliding the phone back into his fund, ignorant that across city, Katie was formally rising from her office, fury kindling, covenanting that Ridge Forrester had just declared war, while inside Forrester Creations, Brooke stood in the wreckage of the man she loved, realizing that the company had survived numerous storms, but this bone had struck at its soul, and Ridge, alone in his office moments latterly, goggled at the sketches on his office, wondering why Palm felt so important like loss, ignorant that Will's exit was only the morning of a chain response that would pull secrets into the light, expose backstabbings, and force every Forrester to choose between heritage and love. The elevators swallowed Will whole as he descended, each bottom flashing like a preamble to exile, and by the time the doors slid open onto the lobby he'd rebuilt himself into commodity colder, commodity harder, the wounded utopian replaced by a quiet storm, because demotion had a way of forging resoluteness. And outside Forrester Creations the megacity roared with incuriosity, taxicabs rushing, people living, ignorant that a heritage had just been disassociated, and Will walked threw it like a ghost, replaying Ridge's words until they burned into him. Get back to your mama's company. As if he were nothing further than a caller in a world he'd believed was also his. And across city Katie Logan felt those words before she ever heard them. The knot in her casket tensing as Will's textbook arrived, her hands pulsing as she reread it, fury blooming with motherly instinct, because Ridge hadn't just fired an hand, he'd rejected her son, and in that moment she came. Not the polished superintendent, not the patient middleman between families, but a mama who would scorch the earth if necessary, while inside Forrester Creations Brooke paced Ridge's office like a boxed heart, demanding he fix this, demanding he call Will back, reminding him that miscalculations were part of growth, that Eric had forgiven far worse, and Ridge snapped that this wasn't about growth, it was about integrity, but Brooke saw the cracks in his armor, saw the man who had just repeated the cycle of judgment that formerly visited him, and she rumored that he'd come what he formerly abominated, a doorkeeper who confused fear with strength, and Ridge turned down, gripping the office, knowing she was right yet unintentional to surrender, because power formerly exercised infrequently loosens its grip fluently, and Steffi, watching from the doorway, told herself this was necessary, that Forrester Creations couldn't be run on sentiment, but indeed she felt the ripple of consequence, the quiet dread that perhaps they had just pushed a pawn into getting a rival, because Will didn't leave broken, he left awakened, and he set up himself wandering the megacity until the sun dipped low, eventually sitting on a bench overlooking the ocean, the same horizon he'd goggled at as a sprat, featuring of a future that now felt stolen, and in that stillness he realized commodity intimidating and empowering all at formerly he didn't need Ridge Forrester's authorization to come great, and when Katie eventually reached him, breathless and fierce, belting him in her arms, he let the wrathfulness inflow, confessing everything, how he'd been set up, how Thomas had twisted narratives, how Ridge no way gave him a chance, and Katie heeded, jaw gripped, formally planning, formally visioning a company that would prove Ridge wrong. Because Logan women didn't shrink from storms, they learned to command them. And back at Forrester Creations the fallout boosted, contrivers questioning leadership, whispers of favoritism poisoning morale, Eric himself summoning Ridge, his disappointment heavier than any cry, reminding him that heritage was erected by rejection but by cultivating the coming generation, and Ridge defended himself, yet the mistrustfulness crept by, because Eric's eyes imaged the boy Ridge formerly was, hopeless to be seen, and hope, shattered by Will's departure, brazen Thomas, criminating him outright, and his trim denial faltered just enough to reveal guilt, planting seeds of verity that would soon grow, and as night fell, two conglomerates began shifting in contrary directions, Forrester Creations tensing its walls, and Katie Logan, fueled by motherly fire, sketching the design of commodity bold, commodity new, commodity that would drink woe-ent as a charity case but as a visionary, because exile type's invention, and Ridge Forrester, ignorant, had just created the veritably competition he stressed, a storm born of rejection, carrying his own blood and bearing the name Logan, fated to rise, not in his shadow, but against his throne. The coming morning, the pressure at Forrester Creations was suffocating, the air thick with rumored rumors and the clatter of keyboards pointed by the occasional shriek of unbelief, as if the entire structure inclusively held its breath, staying for the coming eruption. Contrivers clustered in huddles, assuming whether Will's blasting was endless, whether Ridge had surpassed, whether Brooke would storm in with the fury of a woman who had always defended her children, and nearly. Between the cells and the lustrous runways, Hope walked quietly, replaying every moment, every word, every slight vacillation, the guilt and helplessness ringing in her stomach because she had promised Will she'd cover him, and yet then he was, cast out like a pawn offered for some ancient family pride, and Steffi, ever calculating, watched Ridge from across the office, noting the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he avoided eye contact with Brooke, how every movement screamed that he'd not yield, that he'd made his choice and now all the consequences were others' problem, and Ridge, in his office, eventually allowed himself to exhale, leaning back in his president, gaping at the sketches scattered before him, the subtle curve of dresses, the daring cut of jackets, wondering if he'd truly defended the company or simply his pride, because nearly deep down, he stressed that firing Will wasn't a palm but a crack that would mold, and Eric's words from the former evening echoed louder now than the battle itself, reminding him that leadership wasn't about proving dominance, it was about nurturing gift, and Ridge gripped his fists, the pressure in his jaw hanging to split as he realized that maybe he'd just lit a fuse that could consume him, a fuse that ran straight through the veritably blood he tried to guard. Meanwhile, Will, sitting across from Katie in her office, felt a flicker of stopgap enkindle amidst the ashes of his demotion, her presence a memorial that indeed in defeat there could be a path forward, and Katie's voice, steady yet fierce, outlined a plan, not a deliverance, not a handbill, but an occasion, a place where Will could prove himself on merit alone, and as she spoke, Will's mind contended with ideas, strategies, generalities for designs that had been stewing in his imagination for months, now unleashed by necessity, because nothing forged invention like the sting of rejection, and Katie jounced admiringly as he outlined sketches, portfolios, and fancies that battled the very foundation of Forrester Creations itself, her determination intertwining with his ambition, forming a bond that was equal corridor motherly instinct and commercial warfare, a combination Ridge had no way anticipated, and the study of it made her palpitation quicken because the chessboard of family and business was suddenly more unpredictable than ever, and as they colluded, the outside world remained unconscious, ignorant that the quiet boy they had dismissed would soon rise, not just to contend, but to challenge and conglomerate. Inside Forrester Creations, Brooke paced again, unfit to sit still, every phone call and rumored discussion a memorial of the chaos that Ridge's pride had unleashed, while Hope, eyes red from insomniac nights, brazened Thomas in the plant, demanding answers, criminating him with a venom she had no way allowed herself ahead, and Thomas, caught off guard, stumbled over his words, his casual charm faltering, exposing cracks in his armor that Hope pounced upon, the disclosure that he'd manipulated Ridge's wrathfulness and painted Will as a trouble kindling a fire in her that refused to be extinguished, and as whispers of the verity began to spread among the contrivers and interns, a quiet rebellion formed, small acts of defiance, subtle support for Will, participating stories of his fidelity, of his late nights, of his unwavering passion for design, and Ridge, ever watchful, began to smell the temblors of disgruntlement, the first hints of a storm he'd refused to admit, his mind racing as he wondered whether his decision had defended the company or sown the seeds of its death, and in the meantime, Katie and Will were erecting commodity new, a space for creativity unchained, where merit overbalanced heritage, where gift could flourish without fear of arbitrary redundancy. And every sketch Will drew, every meeting they held, every pitch he presented carried the silent weight of defiance, the implied pledge that Forrester Creations had undervalued him at its pitfall. Meanwhile, Ridge's connections inside the company began to strain, subtle ganders, quiet dubieties, murmurs behind unrestricted doors, Steffi strategically planting seeds of caution, and indeed Brooke, despite her love for him, felt an ocean widening between what Ridge formerly was and what he'd come, because his wrathfulness had been maintainable, maybe, but his prosecution brutal, and the ripple goods extended further than he could see. Touching guests, collaborators, indeed the board, who now rumored about implicit vulnerabilities, about whether Ridge's particular passions were clouding his judgment, and as the day turned to evening, the pressure was nearly palpable, a pressure cooker staying for a spark. Meanwhile, Will, inspired by Katie's mentorship, began conceptualizing a collection that was daring, visionary, commodity that could compete Forrester's most iconic workshop, drawing alleviation from the rejection he'd suffered, the wrathfulness he'd felt, the need to prove himself not to Ridge, but to the world, and each sketch, each design meeting, each donation strengthened his resoluteness, stropping his vision like a blade forged in fire, because in the gauntlet of exile, he discovered a creativity that had been dormant, now burning brighter than ever. Across city, Ridge sat alone in his office late at night, the megacity lights reflecting off the glass, and for the first time, the weight of what he'd done pressed down completely, the silence a stark discrepancy to the chaos he'd unleashed, and recollections of Eric's calm combinations, of Brooke's hopeless pleas, of Will's eyes filled with hurt, all collided, forcing him to defy the uncomfortable verity that occasionally guarding heritage needed further than wrathfulness, it needed modesty, a assignment he'd yet to completely learn, while at the same time, the seeds of vengeance, of competition, of ambition, were taking root outside his walls, in a plant that smelled of possibility and fierce determination, and Ridge couldn't yet see that he'd painted a target on himself and his conglomerate. Meanwhile, Hope, fueled by outrage and fidelity, pledged to support Will in secret, slipping notes, offering advice, and rallying sympathetic contrivers to still support his return, creating a network of abettors that indeed Ridge couldn't descry, and Thomas, seeing the stirring runs, began to scheme. Again, calculating how to work the chaos he'd unleashed to his advantage, ignorant that the ground beneath him was also shifting, and the storms he'd started were hanging to consume him as well, because in a house erected on ambition and heritage, no action was without consequence, and as nights turned into weeks, the pressure only mounted, Will's collection taking shape into commodity revolutionary, drawing attention from fashion critics, investors, and influencers, his name starting to reverberate beyond the Forrester shadow, while Ridge watched reports with apprehension, feeling the first real tremblers of fear, because the boy he'd dismissed was no longer small, no longer vulnerable, he was growing into the very challenge Ridge had refused to nurture, a challenge fueled not by annuity but by gift, vision, and the sting of rejection, and Brooke, fating the ineluctability of the collision, contended with Ridge to open his eyes before it was too late, advising him that pride could destroy indeed the potent conglomerate, but Ridge, stubborn, still cleaved to the notion that the family and company he'd erected could repel the storm, eyeless to the fire that was forming just beyond his grasp, while Katie, seizing every occasion, arranged meetings with investors, lined up exhibits, cultivated media buzz, and set Will for the debut that would shake the fashion world, and Will, formerly reluctant and conditional, now walked with a newfound confidence. Every reversal and personality etched into his resoluteness, every slight a memorial of why he'd to succeed, because failure was no longer an option, not just for himself, but for the communication it would shoot to Ridge, to the Forrester dynasty, to everyone who had misdoubted him, and the moment approached when the worlds would collide, the debut of Will's collection, the first public display of what rejection had wrought, an enterprising line that challenged tradition, embraced invention, and carried the unmistakable mark of someone who had been undervalued by the very man who had tutored him the meaning of both ambition and arrogance, and Rich, hail whispers from the fashion community, glancing early responses online, feeling the tremblers of a heritage under trouble, eventually began to grasp the magnitude of his decision, the consequence of letting wrathfulness mandate judgment, and Brooke, ever the ground between worlds, watched both sides, torn between love, fidelity, and fear, realizing that the family feud she had always tried to temper was about to erupt into a spectacle that could review Forrester creations ever, while Hope, watching from the sidelines, knew that this was only the morning, that the fallout would reshape alliances, enkindle battles, and test every bond within the Logan-Forrester nexus. And as Will's models hit the runway, the followership heaved, critics rumored, and the megacity buzzed with excitement, because the boy who had been cast out was now commanding the room with poise, vision, and inarguable gift, proving that occasionally the topmost pitfalls crop not from ambition alone, but from the fire forged by rejection, demotion, and the unvarying determination to claim a place in a world that formerly told you didn't belong, and Ridge, watching from the murk, felt a stitch he'd no way anticipated, a bitter taste of remorse, a consummation that power and heritage were fragile when tempered with pride, while outdoors, Katie and Will changed victorious ganders, knowing the battle had only begun, yet feeling the sweet swell of triumph that comes when the undervalued eventually rises, and in that moment, Forrester Creations and the Logan conglomerate likewise were on the point of metamorphosis, because one decision, one fiery command to leave, had burned a chain response that would ripple through family, business, love, and ambition, ever altering the balance of power, and icing that the story of Rich, Will, Brooke, Katie, and all those caught in the crossfire would be flashed back as a defining saga of treason, brilliance, and the impregnable force of mortal adaptability.